So today we have a very dear friend and mentor and guide, Dr. Chris Germer from Boston. Chris doesn't need any introduction. He's the expert on the subject of self-compassion, role of mindfulness in leadership, in personal life, and for well-being for self and others. Today, we are fortunate that we have this opportunity to talk to Chris about the role of mindfulness and self-compassion. How can we build these two traits in our life, and what is the importance of these? So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Manish. I'm so happy to be here.
Chris, what brought you to India?
India is the major source of inspiration my entire life. I've always been interested in the contemplative depth and wisdom of India, sacred India. And so I first came to India when I was 25. And I was so moved by what I'd learned that now I'm 72 years old. And that experience when I was 25 years old has guided my entire career. So what I've been doing all these years is integrating the contemplative wisdom of India into modern scientific psychology, and especially into psychotherapy, which overlaps a lot with emotional resilience and leadership and so forth.
And what brought you to self-compassion? When you did your study, your work on self-compassion at Harvard, what intrigued you to work on something like this?
So in about 1985, I started working at Harvard with colleagues who were also interested in bringing contemplative wisdom into modern science, and in particular, how to do that in a secular context. And the language that was most congruent was the language of early Buddhist psychology, which obviously also comes from the Indian subcontinent. And so for about 20 years, I was really immersed in the practice of mindfulness meditation, learning about Buddhist psychology, and also how to integrate that, both scientifically and practically, into Western life. And so that went on merrily for 20 years. But throughout this time, I had a personal struggle, which was, I had a fear of public speaking. I had pretty severe public speaking anxiety. I would panic. And so even though at the time I had a specialization as a clinical psychologist in working with anxiety, and even though that was the case, it really didn't touch my own struggle. And also I was practicing mindfulness throughout this time. And then in kind of a moment of desperation, I had a meditation teacher who said, Chris, why don't you just sit on a cushion and love yourself? In other words, meditation as loving yourself, nothing more than that. Just go love yourself. And it was amazing. I started feeling much better in terms of anxiety in general, but in public speaking anxiety in particular. And then I had a really big Harvard Medical School conference. This was in 2006. And for the first time in my life, when I got up to speak, after basically spending 4 months in meditation, just loving myself, I'd never done this before, okay? This was a unique experience. And when I got up to speak, there was some fear, but something new happened. There was like a new voice in my head that was saying, oh, may you be safe, may you be happy. And I looked at the audience, and usually when you have public speaking anxiety, the audience is the enemy. But at this time, after learning just to love myself as a kind of imperfect human being, I looked down at the audience, everybody looked beautiful to me. This was a radical thing. First time in my life, public speaking anxiety disappeared. So then I started thinking, there's something here I need to understand. This is one of those cases where a great idea emerges out of a impossible problem, Basically, this was self-compassion, learning to be kind to oneself in the midst of an uncompromising problem. And so from that day onward, I started to explore this scientifically, along with a colleague, Kristen Neff, who actually started the research on self-compassion. And now, we created a self-compassion training program, which has been taught to well over 300,000 people by 4,000 teachers on every continent. So there's been incredible interest in this, and the research has been just burgeoning. The interest follows the research. In 2003, there was one article on self-compassion. Now there are over 8,000 articles, which almost across the board just show that self-compassion is good for you. In many ways, it's what we call the secret sauce of emotional health and well-being. And the implications for so many different fields, including business leadership, are just enormous and are now being unpacked by people like yourself.
Thank you so much, Chris. Wonderful story. Very inspiring. It's very common to have a speaking anxiety or stage anxiety, an audience anxiety, and to overcome using something like self-compassion is very unusual, isn't it?
It is, but since I started talking about this in a public setting, so many people have said, this is the secret. But then they wonder, what's the mechanism? How did this work? And the way it worked is that actually behind this anxiety was a sense of shame, a sense of, well, I'm defective, I'm, fraudulent, I'm incompetent. And the funny thing was that self-compassion directly addressed this underlying shame, this underlying issue I didn't even know I had. Basically, it healed the problem without even knowing what the problem was.
Wow. So Chris and I were fortunate to do a recent retreat with few of the leaders and business leaders in India. And we learned a lot during this process of retreat. How did you felt in retreat? What was the thing which you feel that, we asked what are the aha moment. What were your aha moments in the retreat?
Oh, I learned so much. First of all, I just have to say I had such a wonderful time because here we were talking about inner resources, inner skills, inner practices with really high-level, high-achieving business leaders for whom achievement and productivity and profitability are central to what they do. And so here we were in the countryside in 3 hours from Mumbai, with the purpose of looking inward and reflecting one's leadership experience, what it's like, what works, what doesn't work, and also how can I maximize my effectiveness as a leader. So the thing that struck me the most, frankly, was the open-mindedness, because most of these folks didn't really understand how deeply we were going to go inwardly during this time, and they were willing. So I was just so touched by their openness, by their humility, and by their honesty. When something didn't work, they would, or didn't land well for them, they would say it, and we could have really interesting conversations. So I personally learned a lot about leadership, but in particular, I got so much respect for these leaders, and I could see why they became really top leaders in India, like industrial leaders, because of the humanity. The humility, the curiosity, the willingness to learn. These are the things which, in some respects, cannot be taught in business school. And these people were at, you could say, the pinnacle of business leadership, probably because of these qualities. And yet, they wished to actually become more effective. So what we were considering together is, what would it be like if we intentionally cultivated compassion and compassionate leadership? My sense was these people were naturally compassionate. But what would it be like if we did this on purpose? What would that look like? Scientifically, what can we expect? Practically, how would we integrate compassion into leadership skills? And so this to me was so interesting. I learned so much through our interactions and our dialogue, but mostly I was just touched by the friendship also. A real friendship developed.
To give more context, recently I had the privilege of teaching along with Dr. Chris, sitting next to him, learning from him, sharing my wisdom on mindfulness and a little bit on self-compassion, and on self-compassion to the leaders. And we had a very good time in interacting with these top leaders from India and explaining the role of mindfulness and self-compassion and how it can build the better leadership style for themselves and for their teams. And it was a wonderful journey, isn't it?
It was wonderful, yeah.
One thing, when they came in, there was a lot of curiosity. The question which also audience would like to listen, why self-compassion and mindfulness so important in today's business environment?
Well, first of all, mindfulness and compassion, including self-compassion, are natural human qualities which have helped human beings since the dawn of humanity to meet challenges and to grow from those challenges. And so human beings are the most remarkable species because of our capacity to adapt. And what are those qualities that have allowed human beings to adapt? One is mindful awareness. In other words, the ability to step back, to really look clearly at what's going on, and to respond effectively. That's mindfulness. And then compassion is when things go wrong, as they inevitably do. Leaders, there's a saying, leadership is difficult. You will probably not have 2 easy days in a row. And if you do have an easy day, you can expect next day not so easy. Yeah, this is the nature of leadership. So what happens when it's tough? How does a effective leader, a top leader like the people who are in the room, respond when there are these challenges? And so compassion has been an innate capacity for human beings forever. It's a way of being with setbacks, failures, challenges, difficulties, a way of being with that we actually can learn from it and that we can actually motivate ourselves to make necessary changes. Even decision-making is facilitated by compassion. It opens our field of awareness so that we can actually see the options and then to act on and do what needs to be done. So these two qualities, they're innate, but they can also be cultivated. So that's the amazing thing. We can become more mindful. We can become more compassionate. And one of the things that we were really focusing on in this workshop was really more of a retreat, was an aspect of compassion which is often overlooked, but is central to effective leadership. And the research is very clear, is associated with enhanced productivity and even indirectly with profitability, and that's self-compassion. So compassion is, when it's in full bloom, is universal. It's outer, it's inner, it's up, down, left, right. But self-compassion, in other words, to include ourselves in the circle of compassion. For a leader, when things get tough, to respond to their own experience with kindness. And when they need to do something difficult in the world, to be able to feel within their own spirit a kind of firm kindness, a firm toughness. These are essential skills for leaders. I'm not just saying this, it's all over the research. And so that's what we were doing. We were focusing on how to cultivate mindfulness and also how to cultivate compassion and self-compassion in order to create a compassionate workplace, which the research is absolutely clear about, is good for leaders, good for employees, and good for customers, good for productivity, and good for profitability.
Well, that's so great. And I think the audience which we were interacting with very receptive to the idea, and it was very surprised to them, how effective they can become by use of mindfulness while making difficult decisions, while doing difficult conversation, while dealing with situations which is unexpected, because how Chris said that there are no 2 equal days in any leader's life. I think it's so true for everyone in our life. There are no two same days. And some days are good. And how do we deal with good days? Because we also don't know how to deal with our good days. And also we don't know how to deal with our bad days. So self-compassion allows both the side to see from a very different lens, and how do we savor these moments of good and bad. And what bad is not always bad, bad is, if we learn from something from bad, it's good actually. But if we think bad is really bad, then it's really, really bad.
Yeah, the most important lessons we actually learn from challenges. This is just a fact of life. I mean, we would like to go through our lives without setbacks, without failures, without challenges. But if we did that, we wouldn't learn much, So, it's funny. I mean, we don't invite challenges much, but in retrospect, that's what has moved us forward the most.
Yes. And somebody said, success is hollow. The challenge is full of opportunity.
Yeah. Somebody said that. That was a beautiful comment. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So, success is, we always like success, all of us. Everybody likes success. But, when you start learning from the challenges and difficulties, then success becomes more sweeter, for that matter. You enjoy success more. Many leaders, feel that, this self-compassion and mindfulness can make them complacent, make them less driven leaders. Maybe make them soft towards others. And how do you deal with this myth?
Well, so there are a number of myths. The research shows that they're actually misconceptions. They have a kind of a cringe factor. We go like, we hear the term self-compassion. Sometimes we hear the term mindfulness and we go, I'm not so sure about that. But those misgivings are actually misconceptions, because the research really shows that what one is concerned about with those resources are not substantiated by the research. So we can talk about mindfulness as well, but just talking about self-compassion, there are 5 main myths. One is that it's going to make us selfish. Self-compassion make us selfish. In other words, the word of self in self-compassion makes people, I'm going to become selfish. But it's not true. Actually, people who grow in self-compassion, they usually grow in compassion for others, Another myth is that it's going to make us weak or soft. Well, the 8,000 studies on self-compassion, in 2 words can be summarized with the term emotional resilience. In other words, coping, bouncing back, learning from and growing. Growth mindset is a natural consequence of self-compassion. So we find that, when difficulties occur, and even big difficulties, traumas occur in life, that when a person is self-compassionate, they bounce back much easier. And this is so essential for leaders, because when things don't go right, they need to have their head screwed on right, they need to be able to see clearly, and they need to be able to make decisions. Self-compassion is a resource which helps that to happen. So that's one concern. Another one is self-indulgence, as you mentioned. In other words, some people think, okay, I'm self-compassionate, I'm just going to sit around and eat chocolate and, watch, movies on television, or, I don't have to do anything anymore. But actually, what we find is people who are high in self-compassion, they take actually wiser care of themselves. People who are self-compassionate, they actually do hard things, but from a different foundation, from the foundation of wishing themselves well, wishing themselves the best. So they generally eat healthier, they exercise more. When they're tired, they go to sleep rather than, just driving themselves crazy. So those are 3 things. Another concern that people have is self-compassion is like self-pity. Self-pity means you get kind of wrapped up in yourself and you say, why me? Why this happened to me? We become like a little ball, But the research shows that people who are self-compassionate actually have more perspective, that can see their situation from a broader context, and they're actually less ruminative. They ruminate less. They're less self-absorbed. But the most important thing for business leaders, because business leaders really need to, motivate themselves sometimes to do tough things. Business leadership coaching is often inspirational and motivational. And so how does self-compassion help with that? Well, it's a very interesting thing that people who are high in self-compassion, they're actually more motivated to reach their goals. And the secret is that there are two ways to try to reach our goals. One is through self-criticism. In other words, when things go wrong, blaming ourselves and kicking ourselves. And the other way is with self-encouragement. In other words, yeah, this hurts. I got that. It didn't work. But you know what? You can figure this out. You have the building blocks. You know how to do this. And what you don't know, you can learn. This is workable. So that voice, that quality of kind of positive coaching, care and coaching, motivating through encouragement rather than criticism, is fundamental to achieving goals, and especially achieving lofty goals that might be difficult. You know, the most important things in life ultimately are things that we achieve by overcoming obstacles. So how do we overcome these obstacles? We need to do this with inner encouragement, and that is fundamental to self-compassion. Mindfulness runs through this whole thing, which is the capacity to see clearly in a spacious and non-judgmental way. So we really need a combination of these two.
Doing this lot of work which we have done recently, and we found that leaders are accepting there is a burnout, there's a stress. It's very important that we accept there is a stress and burnout. And that's the route to accept that they need compassion for themselves. And there is a room for mindfulness. In our work recently, we saw that there was definitely a lot of stress for the leaders. What prevent leaders to practice something like mindfulness? Or what is a major barrier in practicing mindfulness and self-compassion for leaders?
I think it's mostly misunderstanding. People don't realize what it is. They think it's a lot of work, or they think it makes people, soft or demotivated or something like that. Because our experience at this workshop and also other workshops is that when a person actually knows what it is, they often have like an aha moment, like, oh, this is good. I can do this. So I think folks just need to give it a try.
It was earlier understood when I started career, in a very early part of my life. It said, keep your emotions at home, keep this compassion thing at home, being emotionless, be more strong, be more man, to be at office, deal with your teams. And this command control style of dealing team was very common. And now we are telling people to have self-compassion, compassion, which is a very different perspective as compared to the leaders were supposed to be taught. Now, how do this transition can take place? Do people will understand that role of self-compassion? And what's your view on that?
Well, some people will understand and some won't. The thing is that the command and control model has short-term benefits, but it's not sustainable in the long term. In the long term, we also need to be aware. We need to have emotional intelligence. We need to know what's going on inside of us. And we also need to be able to work with what's going on inside of us. So it's a better long-term approach. Short-term, definitely a kick is useful. But long-term, you can't be kicked all the time and function.
One thing which I think on last I want to ask you, what do you think as a future we should be doing to bring this knowledge to more and more leaders? What do you think? What should we be doing?
Well, I think that when people understand what this is, and then they begin to see the benefit to their teams and their organizations, really very small amount of changes can have large impact. When people start to see that, in other words, when they see the cost benefit of mindfulness, the cost benefit of self-compassion, they're in.
We are bringing a special program on mindfulness and self-compassion for leaders. It's a short program because most of the time we saw the biggest challenge is we don't have time. So the biggest barrier is we don't have time, and we don't know if this kind of thing will work on us, because it says that, it's easy to say but difficult to practice. So that's why we are trying to make this program easy for understanding and then easy to practice as well.
Easy to practice. Yeah. It is easy to practice. Mindfulness and self-compassion is always a relief. It's not extra. It's removing the unnecessary. It makes our lives simpler and easier.
Yeah. Today when me and Chris was having a cup of tea, a cat came and it sat next to us. And when I suddenly touched on the head of the cat, not only cat enjoyed, but I also enjoyed the compassion with the cat.
Good metaphor.
Yeah. And so when we bring compassion to others, in this process, we benefit ourselves also. And if we do reverse, if we bring self-compassion to ourselves, it benefit to others. It's a two-way street.
Yeah.
It's not only for selfish, but also for others to enjoy your company. So how would you like you to be? That you would like to be loved, or you would like to be hated as a leader? It's up to you. And self-compassion makes you a favorite leader. Thank you, Chris. You have a last word to say. Anything what you think?
Oh, I just am excited about the integration of mindfulness and self-compassion into commerce, because there are so many people who work in business, who work in commerce, who are leaders. I think the potential to bring great relief to unnecessary struggle in the world. One of the ways of doing that is through business, through commerce, through leadership. So I have a lot of energy for this, because I think that the benefit is enormous, and the amount of effort to do this, very small.
Great. One more thing. Today, me and Chris were walking on the Carter Road in Mumbai. So while we were walking, we saw a few of the young boys and girls were doing burpees. It was very interesting. Chris made a very interesting remark, and he asked me, Manish, do you know what is the definition of competition? Chris, would you like to repeat that? What's the definition of competition?
Yeah, sort of the origin of the word competition is to strive together. Strive together. So when people think of competition, they often think of like beating an opponent. But it actually is not that. It's that we are becoming more excellent by doing this together. We're both improving, We're all improving. When we compete, we are actually increasing the chance to become more excellent, rather than a zero-sum game where somebody loses and somebody wins, because that ultimately breaks the heart. We can all become better.
So you understand the meaning that it's not only about us, but it's also about you. And when we do it together, we can bring the change in the world. And that's competition, and that's healthy competition. So we'll come back to you with a great program, and we look forward you to connect with us if you want to know more about self-compassion and mindfulness in increasing your productivity, performance, leadership, and bring profit to your organization. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Manish.